Dear friends, thank you so much for coming to hear one of my favorite people in the whole world, Arden Lee. I met Arden when I was 17 years old in Shorewood, Wisconsin, and she lived there with a dear friend who lived nearby, Beth McKenty, who taught my mother the faith, and she and Arden taught my mother the faith, and I was also being taught at the same time. And I was a little bit rebellious, but she still loved me, and so we're still together. So what I'd like to say, very, very briefly, is that Arden has had so many wide experiences since she became a Baha'i in 1952. As a youth in her 20s, she went off to Cambodia to teach the faith. So we need to understand that the youth movement in the Baha'i faith has been going on not just recently, not just in the last 20 or 30 years, but for over 62 years, and even before that with the founding of our faith. So the other thing I'd like to say about Arden is she continually has been actively teaching the principles and the love of Baha'u'lláh. She went on pilgrimage to Iran. She's been in Iran twice. She has been travel teaching to the southern part of the United States and to many other places. I know in Wisconsin and in the Midwest, she would put Baha'i books in many libraries, teach in prisons, teach in so many places before there were any Baha'is or any thought of Baha'i faith. And she is currently on the local spiritual assembly of Reno, and we're so lucky to have her here. And I could speak for about another 50 minutes just about her, but that would take away from all the wonderful things I know she's going to say. So I'd like to start with a prayer. Vouchsafe unto me, O my God, the full measure of thy love and good pleasure. And through the attractions of thy resplendent light, enrapture our hearts, O thou who art the supreme evidence and the all-glorified. Send down upon me, as a token of thy grace, thy vitalizing breezes throughout the daytime and in the night season. O Lord of bounty, no deed have I done, O my God, to merit beholding thy face, and I know of a certainty that were I to live as long as the world lasts, I would fail to accomplish any deed such as to deserve this favor, inasmuch as the station of the servant shall ever fall short of access to thy holy precincts, unless thy bounty should reach me, and thy tender mercy pervade me, and thy loving kindness encompass me. And grant that I may remain steadfast in my love for thee. Thou art the powerful, the gracious, the self-subsisting, the bestower, the compassionate, the almighty, the all-bountiful. Abdul Baha.
And before we begin, I just wanted to say we will take a 15-minute break at 8 o'clock so that you don't wear it around and ask for all sorts of extraneous things. And then we will eat and resume until 9 o'clock. So, really, listen up. No, you're yes.
Come in, come in. This is a great joy for me to be with you. It's very exciting when Annette and Sherry come to me and tell me who they are, because I only remember them as children. A long time ago, we all, this family and mine, came from the area of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And of course, in those days, everybody was pioneering. They were all going in different directions, as her family did, and some of my family did. There's another lady I remember. Sharon Riley Hick was here when I was here last with Nader Saeidi. That was at least 5 years ago, maybe longer. And her passing and leaving this world was so sudden. I know that her love was with her family and the Baha'i faith and her friends here, and that she's still with us. The subject that comes to a person of my age at this time of life is the subject of sacrifice, which when I was a young person in Wisconsin, I really didn't think about. I feel now that it is a very important subject to talk about within Baha'i communities, because since the beginning of this faith, Baha'is have sacrificed so much. We know about the prisoners who are in Iran, the Yaran, and the others who are in prison there for being Baha'is. And of course, if they would say, I don't believe in Baha'u'lláh, they would be free. But there's a sacrifice for Baha'u'lláh to remain in this prison and accept what happens to them standing up for the faith. And many, many others have sacrificed. Of course, we knew about the life of Baha'u'lláh, about Abdu'l-Baha's life, and certainly the Guardian is another who sacrificed his whole life for the cause of God. And maybe newer friends coming into the faith these days might not know very much about his life. But one of my great blessings in being a Baha'i when I was young was that the beloved Guardian was still in this world. And in 1954, in May, I had a pilgrimage during his lifetime, and it was a great experience for me to know that I could go to this beautiful place, which was physically undeveloped at that time. There were no big, beautiful gardens in 1954, but the presence was there. And he would be every evening at this long table with the Western pilgrims, and he would see the Persian pilgrims for tea in the afternoon. Meanwhile, there were three of us, 3 Western pilgrims. I mean, that's all. And we lived in the home that later was to become the meeting place of the House of Justice until the seat of the House of Justice was built. And there were hands of the cause present, like Leroy Iwas and his wife, and Millie Collins, who had been invited to live there, and Charles Remy was there, and maybe people would come periodically and visit during our 9-day pilgrimage. But what the Guardian did, he would serve everybody. And the lady from the kitchen would bring the rice out. It was a very simple dish, sometimes with chicken, sometimes with vegetables, and he would put the spoonfuls on each person's plate. The plates would be passed to him. And he would speak to each person at this table about a specific subject. Sometimes he would ask Leroy Iwas to go to the government meetings in Jerusalem and represent the Baha'i faith. And he knew everything that was connected with each person sitting there. as well as what was going on in the world everywhere. There were pilgrims from Africa, pioneers, who had gone to Africa. The man was descended from King Kamehameha in Hawaii, and his wife was from the mainland, and they came on pilgrimage. It was his great joy to meet someone from a native background, like from Hawaii. And that was his joy, to see the progress of the faith. If we remember his life as a young man, when Abdu'l-Baha sent him to Oxford to study English and other things, and he was in Balliol College, and he wasn't there too long before his grandfather died. And then he was shocked to find out that he was the guardian. He didn't know that. He didn't know he would have to take on this faith at the time that it happened. So he came back by ship, of course, in 1921, and he had to take time away. He went to Switzerland for months when Abdu'l-Baha's sister, the greatest holy leaf, would maintain connection with all the Baha'i communities in the world to maintain stability and, unity until the guardian came back from Switzerland to be the guardian. Meanwhile, in his own life, he had to conquer himself. He knew, of course, being a guardian meant you have no life of your own. He could have no life of his own. He had to establish the faith around the world, establish the administration, make sure that all these many places around the world that had no Baha'is living in them would eventually have Baha'is. That's how the 10-year crusade was established. 1953 to 1963 is when Baha'is from everywhere in the world, and many from Wisconsin and Minnesota, went to these remote places. So that by the end of the 10-year crusade in 1963, there were only 2 places left in the world where Baha'is did not go that were on this list of the guardians. They were Sakhalin Island, which was a military base of the Russians, just off the coast of Russia, near Alaska. And the other one was one of the small countries near Nepal, where the government was closed to tourists couldn't come in. But eventually those places were settled. Beth McKenty was one of the ones who settled in Sakhalin. And because she was a journalist, she got into the country as one of the first Baha'is, if not the first Baha'i, to go there. And that was an island of about, I think she said 6 or 8 miles across and quite long. It was a very remote place. It is the guardian we're speaking of now, and you can go on your internet, because if you have an internet, you can find out anything you want. I don't have internet. I'm still sorting out things at my house from my files of 60 years collection. Now, I've found so many exciting things. But anyway, that's another subject. When I think about the guardian, I think about the book he wrote, God Passes By, which has in it details of Baha'u'llah's life that we would never know except for that book. And one of the places in it, page 119, it is. Yes, page 119. He was very disappointed. Baha'u'llah was disappointed in the reaction of the Iraqi people when he was there waiting. It was Rizwan time, and he was unhappy that the people had not responded to his faith. And he said this, it's recorded there, bid them recite remover of difficulties, and he puts the words out there. Is there any remover of difficulty? 500 times, nay, 1,000 times, by day and by night, sleeping and waking, that haply the countenance of glory may be unveiled to their eyes, and tears of light may descend upon them. Well, that's something that we who live now can benefit by greatly if we do that. We've had experience in Reno with using 500 remover of difficulties, most amazing results. When some of the friends come together, I'm not going to tell you the stories, but there are many, just to explain that we have at our hands this great power given to us by Baha'u'lláh before he went off to Sulaymaniyeh, at which he got so unhappy with the conditions that he just went off to Sulaymaniyeh. And this is powerful for us. It's, of course, a prayer of the Bab. And when we do this, sometimes 8 people come, sometimes 3, but whatever it is, we use a book that has 500 pages in it, and one person turns the pages to make sure that we've said the 500. And usually before we're finished, there is a very wonderful bonding and spiritual presence that comes forth, and we concentrate on one subject, one thing that is absolutely essential, like sometimes the healing of people who are dying. We have had results with that. Or people who don't have jobs and work, we gather for them and we do this. The results are quite remarkable, so I'm hoping that every community will do that when it's necessary to do that. Speaking of sacrifice, Mr. Qadem, whom I'm sure many of you have met, hand of the cause, who was asked in the 1950s, early 1950s, by the Guardian to come here to this country, to settle near where the Baha'i National Center is, where he moved into Skokie with his wife and brought his 5 children to America. He was here, he didn't speak English at that time, and he had to learn it, which was very difficult for him. But his presence was so powerful that the Guardian wanted him to be in this country, to inspire all of us, which he did at Green Lake many times, and you might have heard him there. When the Guardian died, 1957, he had not said to Mr. Qadem, well, now you can go back to Iran. And since he didn't say that, Mr. Qadem refused to leave. He felt the Guardian meant for him to stay here and not go back. And in doing that, and staying here, Mr. Qadem lost all of his properties, all of his homes, and he was a very wealthy man in Iran, but he lost everything because he didn't go back and claim it. And the government took everything that he had in Iran. He lived here in an apartment in Skokie instead of one of his big homes in Iran. He attended many gatherings, spoke often, brought his spirit, his wonderful spirit, to us. And I had a picture, let's see, of him. But anyway, it's also on that table. There are a lot of things on that table that I found in my files that you might find interesting. This picture of him is, I'm not sure the exact year, that Pine Springs prayer gathering, all nations gathered in prayer. Pine Springs, Arizona. Mr. Qadem met this wonderful young Navajo Baha'i named Chester Khan, and Chester was 19 years old, and he said, Chester, I want to be among the native people. And I would come to Pine Springs if you could bring all of the different tribes together. And that's what Chester did. Chester is now 78 or so years old and lives still in Gallup, New Mexico. No, it's not. Well, Gallup, New Mexico is very close to the Arizona place where the Baha'i, it's called Native American Baha'i Institute. It's in Houck, Arizona, and it's really close to the border of New Mexico. And so that's what happened. All these tribes came together for a weekend, and the Baha'is somehow managed to feed all these tribes of people out in the middle of the desert. And that's what this picture is about. Mr. Kadem with Chester Khan, whose entire family became Baha'i after that event. He and his brother, Chester and Franklin, were both in future years to serve on the National Baha'i Assembly. But I show this picture and think of Mr. Kadem because it was his happiest time in this country, when he could be among the native peoples. This was his great joy. And then he had to go back to Chicago, and that was not easy for him. In any case, he left this world and is buried in the cemetery in Chicago, having suffered for months of the most terrible illness. And his sacrifice was total for the faith and for the West and for us. So I think of him when I think about sacrifice. And every Baha'i in some way makes a sacrifice when we stand up for the faith. That is our greatest joy, but it's also, I think it brings enrichment of our lives to stand up for the faith when there are times that people might ridicule some part of it or make it difficult for us. Nevertheless, that standing up for the faith at any time in our lives is the greatest joy we will also have in our lives. There's a lot of stories about Nader Saeidi, and about how he got, I don't know if he ever told any of you, because he knew you, how he got to this country. It was absolutely impossible to get him out of Iran in 1980 or so when he came here. You know, it was the time when American hostages were taken by the youth students of Iran, surrounded the embassy, and so that was closed. The U.S. stopped mail service between the countries, flights into Tehran, and so forth. And so, how were we going to get him out of Iran? When there was no communication, we could reach by phone, and that was the last thing we had to do. But it's a total miracle that he got out, because the concourse on high, Baha'u'lláh, wanted him out of Iran. That was it. Otherwise, how would he write these books that he wrote later on? At the request of the House of Justice, he wrote the first book. At the second book he wrote after the House of Justice invited him to come to the Holy Land for 3 months to index the writings of the Bab. Not to translate them, but just index them. And when he did this, he was so moved by the writings of the Bab that he had to write the book, Gate of the Heart. So when you go back and find your book, Gate of the Heart, page 310 to 312 is an astounding thing that we can learn from this book. I want to just mention it because this is another power in the faith that we can use. He discovered that the Bab said, all deeds are acceptable if they are performed to attain the good pleasure of God. And then the Bab says, for us to utter these words at the time of our action. And this is a quotation that's in the book. Verily, I do this for God, the Lord of the heavens and the earth, the Lord of all that is seen and unseen, the Lord of creation. That's the quotation. And then, should he recite this in his heart, his action would be rewarded as a result. So here we have another way that we can bring the power of the Spirit into our own lives and make whatever we choose to do in the path of God successful. Because anything is possible, to the Spirit. And maybe people's lives are very difficult at this time. There is a way for Baha'is to rise above this. And we have all this power in our hands because Baha'u'lláh, Abdu'l-Baha, the Guardian, the Concourse on High, they're just waiting for us to ask them for help. I could go on and on with this story about Nader because when he thought it was impossible, so many times we had failed to get the papers to him. Finally, Swiss Air agreed to carry the papers from Chicago. They hand-carried them from Milwaukee, where I lived. They were all the papers from the university that gave him the necessary things to get a visa from the U.S. Embassy and come here. But there was no U.S. Embassy in Iran. He had to go some other place, some other country. And he was saying, it's impossible. It's not going to work. Well, Swiss Air did something which no other airline would do because they said it's illegal to do this. Swiss Air took those papers, hand-carried from Milwaukee, where they had a little office, to the Chicago airport, to a pilot who flew into Tehran on one of those flights, took them to the office in Tehran so that Nader could go and get them. That's amazing. Only the Spirit could have thought of that one. And then after he got them, at the airport, the government took his passport and said, we have to check first to see if you're on the list that can't leave the country. Well, fortunately, he lived in Isfahan instead of Tehran, so he wasn't on the list. He got his passport back, got a plane, but while he was in the airport, an announcement comes out and says, if you think you're going to get a visa to go to America as a student, forget it. They're not giving visas anymore to students from Iran. So he called me. He said, it's useless. This isn't going to work. That's the amazing thing, because I called the person that I'd been talking to, a Wisconsin congressman. His secretary had been talking to for many months, like 6 months, trying to find out what to do. And they said, oh, you have to tell your friend to go to London and knock on the door of the embassy and say, Ambassador Brewster is expecting me, and he'll get his visa. And what had happened in the meantime was the Congressman Henry Royce, he said he was called to Germany for a meeting, an unexpected meeting. And on his return, he stopped in London to visit his friend, Ambassador Brewster, who they went to college together. And he told him about your friend, because this congressman knew that Nader would have been killed if he'd stayed in Iran. And when Nader first he called me back, and I told him that. He said, why would the ambassador expect me? And I said, I don't know, but you better do that. Go to London and do that. He did. He knocked on the door. He got a 4-year multiple exit entry visa. And the person who gave it to him said, how did you get this? Nobody gets this. And he said he didn't know. So anyway, that's the Spirit working, And he came to Milwaukee about 1981, I think it was. He had a Persian rug over his shoulder, about 6 feet long, big one, and a tiny suitcase, because he really didn't intend to stay very long. He didn't want to leave Iran. And it was very fortunate that he had a multiple exit entry visa, because he went back to Iran twice. He didn't want to stay in this country. It was amazing when he went to the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee and found, he said, all those books on sociology in this library I've read already. And they can't teach me anything. I'm not going to stay here. So it was, what are we going to do now? Send him to Madison, Wisconsin. There's more there, so go there. He did. He took the bus, he went there, and he got his doctorate there. He stayed long enough to get it there. And he got it in 1 year, and they said, please, stay for 2 years. We'll give you a job. You can be a TA, but it'll make us look bad if you get your doctorate in 1 year. And he did that. He stayed 2 years. And after going back twice, his mother crying, saying to him, the Revolutionary Guards have been looking for you. Don't come back. He still went back, but he didn't stay long this time. He knew how bad it was getting. Where his own teacher, Dr. Hakim, had been killed, and many of the Baha'is of that time that were his friends and his teachers were no longer living there. He came back within a few days, and he stayed in Madison and then got the job at Carleton and stayed there for almost 30 years. Now, and see, all of that was a sacrifice for him. It isn't that everybody wants to live in this country. It was a sacrifice because he really didn't want to come here. And now he had tenure at Carleton. He was doing so well there, head of the sociology department. He consulted with the House of Justice. He said, there's at UCLA in Los Angeles, they've been looking for a person to teach the Baha'i faith as a course, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And for 2 years, they can't find anybody who wants to give up their job and give up everything just to teach for 3 hours a week. You can't live on that in Los Angeles. But that's what he did, because the House of Justice said, well, what would it be like if a non-Baha'i taught that course? And then he realized that they are saying to him, maybe you should go there. And he did that. He gave up his tenure, his house, his garden, and everything, and he went to UCLA, where he is now, and he lives in a small apartment, and he teaches that course 3 times. And who are his students? They're Muslims from Iran who are at UCLA, and they want to know what the Baha'i faith is. It's an amazing event how this is happening. Anyway, there's a lot to that story which we don't have time for right now. There's a letter. I think it's over there. It's called, the title on the top is Majrikal Azkar. It's a copy of an old letter written in 1923 when there was no Baha'i assembly in this country. And under it, it says Temple Unity, Baha'i Temple Unity, is what it says. Because the early Baha'is were in this country in 1923, had decided at the approval of Abdu'l-Baha to build the house of worship in Wilmette. And they had already purchased the land. They had to put the water in, the sewer, the heating system in the underground part to keep it from freezing or whatever. In the winters were bad and so on. So is a 2-page letter written by this committee. One of them, Harry Randall, they called him Harry. I guess his name was William Randall. And he was the president of this committee and the treasurer. And Alfred Lunt, who was a lawyer in Boston, who was the secretary. So the two of them wrote this letter asking Baha'is, please, if you could put away $3 to $5 and contribute it to the temple because we have to pay a loan. They'd taken out a loan of $10,000 to do all the work, and they were owing $5,000 at this time. So they needed the Baha'is to put, and you know that $3 to $5 in 1923 was like $50 today, or more maybe. It was not easy for those people at that time in history to build what they built. So for a very long time, that lower level construction was covered with a tarp because there was never money enough to start building the temple with only, maybe 1,000 Baha'is in the whole country. So they had to cover it up. And for years, it became what the city of Wilmette called an eyesore, until they came to the Baha'is and said, you have to do something with this. You can't leave it this way anymore. So you can see how long it took from then, 1923 or before, until 1953 to build the house of worship. When it was dedicated in 1953, you can see how many years it took to build it. But what a great structure it is. Could never be repeated now. The letter is there, and the original is going to Stanford because they have agreed to take all of my collection. For 60 years, I've been collecting all these things, that early books, letters, and those that were written and from, before 1938. Everything before 1938 came from a collection started by Grace Ober. Grace Ober was the person who lived in Beverly, Massachusetts, and she would collect all the letters that came from Abdu'l-Bahá, from the Holy Land. They'd be translated in the East, on the East Coast, with a number of Persian, like Ali Quli Khan and some others, who would translate messages of Abdu'l-Bahá, and then they'd give them to her, and she would type them on onion skin paper with carbon paper in between, and she'd make a lot of copies and mail them off to the Baha'is around the country so they could know what Abdu'l-Bahá said. There are 500 of those, 500 messages from Abdu'l-Bahá to this country that are, very precious on onion skin paper. So Stanford University wants the originals. I made some copies of them, but the originals will all be at Stanford, and it will be in the Baha'i collection. So for future, it's really for future researchers, because it's the Baha'is that are making history in this world. We are the history, that's why. I want to talk about that later. I'm still thinking about sacrifice in a way, because Dizzy Gillespie became a Baha'i, and there's a wonderful story about how that happened. He did shows very often in Chicago, usually in a nightclub, and in Milwaukee he would come and do one or two every now and then at the Milwaukee Auditorium. And Beth McKenty went to one of those shows, and she knew the drummer. And his name was Mongo, his last name, M-O-N-G-O. And she went backstage after the show to see the drummer. And when she got back there, he was already gone, and Dizzy Gillespie was still there. So she told him why she had come, and he said, well, he's gone, we can talk. And they talked. And she told him about the Baha'i faith, and she said, I'm sure she told him that Mongo was a Baha'i, because a number of the drummers in those days were. And just like Doc Holliday, who wrote a book about his experience as being a Baha'i. He was another one of the musicians of that time, and they became Baha'is. So what it evolved into was, when Dizzy would come back to Chicago, she and her husband would go and see him at the club. And it became a pattern that they would do that. Whenever he came into Chicago, they'd go down to the club and see him. And he set aside a couple of tables called the Coke tables because he knew they would be drinking Coca-Cola and not drinking alcohol. So he knew that in many cities where he went, he had tables in the front set aside for Baha'is. And after the show, they'd go back and talk with him about the faith. And at one point, I don't remember how many years, how long the time was in between these things. But at one point, Charlie Parker died. There's a movie that Clint Eastwood did about Charlie Parker. In the end, the movie shows a guy with a beret, that's supposed to be Dizzy Gillespie, at the funeral. But he never went to the funeral. In reality, he couldn't go. He was so broken up about his closest friend dying. He died of an OD, you know. He was young, very young, that he just couldn't bear to go to the funeral. And so that happened in St. Louis. That's where he's buried. So at one point, Beth said to him, when you're next in Chicago, I'll come on your day off. That's usually Mondays, they don't play. And we will fly to St. Louis, and we will do a Baha'i funeral for Charlie Parker. Something really lifted from him when that happened. She seemed to know what a person needed in their life, because they would talk with her about things that they couldn't do and they needed to resolve and so forth. So they flew to St. Louis, and she had a bottle of attar of roses from Baha'is around the world where she would get it from, mostly the Hands of the Cause would get this for her. And she spread the attar of roses across the grave of Charlie Parker. And he blew his trumpet and played over the grave. And they read Baha'i prayers. Both of them read Baha'i prayers over the grave. And she said a light rain started falling, and it was like a confirmation to them that, you know, of the Spirit. And it was after that that he became a Baha'i. He would travel the world for the U.S. government, you know, giving concerts everywhere in the world. There was a statistic that was almost unbelievable. I can't remember it exactly now, but when he was 72 years old, he was giving concerts, sometimes 2 a day, in all the countries of Europe. They all loved him. They gave him in Israel. And when he would get to Israel, he would go to the Baha'i World Center, to the seat of the House of Justice, and he would sit. If you've been on pilgrimage, you know that big central area with that big blue Chinese rug with a circle in the middle. Well, he would sit in the middle in the circle, and the members of the House of Justice would sit around him. His manager told me this story. He said, well, the 9 ministers were sitting around him, and Diz would sit there in the middle, and they said to him, tell us about the world. It was amazing to hear that, you know. And so he had consultation with the Universal House of Justice. He always taught about the oneness of religion, the oneness of races and everything when he did these trips, these concerts around the world. Well, at one time, he had a heart attack, and he knew he was dying. So he prayed, and he asked Baha'u'lláh to give him some more time. I don't remember what age he was at the time, but he survived it. And from then on, he would never do any show without mentioning the faith. You know, if you think about back to the Johnny Carson shows, Johnny Carson never asked a serious religious question, ever, ever. It was only for fun, everything. So he would speak to Dizzy about music, and Dizzy would say, Baha'u'lláh says, you know. So my husband picked that up, and he would tell people that his wife would say, speaking about baseball, Baha'u'lláh says, he thought that no matter what the subject comes up, there is always a way to mention the Baha'i faith. And that's what Dizzy did. So he left this world in 1963? No, what year?
No, Dizzy was post-92.
It was.
Supposed to be at the World Congress.
That's what it was. And at that time, Rahil Khanum and Violette went to see him at his home. It was about 2 weeks before he died. And, you know, and they praised him because, of course, he really believed in Baha'u'lláh. He knew who founded this faith. This is the cause of God. It's not just another man-made interpretation of religion. It's the moving force. So we are so blessed to be a part of that moving force. And I think of it every day because the older I get, the more I appreciate each day. There's a power here, a power that is connected to the ancient power. It's not, we know it's the new revelation, 150 years old or so, but actually it's much more ancient than that. It's the force. And what Mr. Faizi, Hand of the Cause, would say, it was that he wrote an article for the Baha'i News, and he described a mystic man named Ibn Arabi. This is the one. Ibn Arabi was a mystic born in Spain in 1150 on the Christian calendar. And somehow Mr. Faizi, who spoke 7 languages, found this book that this man had written way back in those days. A man who had lived in Mecca, Medina, was a lawyer, you know, a very highly educated man, moved to Baghdad and died there at the age of 78 after he'd written this mystical book. But in that book, this is what he writes. He says, all the followers of the promised Qaim will be put to death except one, whose face will shine with Abha beauty in the plains of Akka. This is 1150. His branch, with a capital B, will build the temple of God. After him, with a capital H, a young boy or youth will sit on the throne whose name will start with SH, and he will have some 30 years only. After him, the whole world will turn their faces to God. That's from 1100. You know, it's just amazing to think of how this force has been in process for so many eons in time. So this is another one you can read fully over there.
Arden, it is now 9 o'clock. They're bringing the food
8
down,
o'clock.
or 8
Huh.
o'clock, I'm sorry.
I hope
Would
not.
would this be a nice time?
Sure.
To take the break,
Yes.
and we can, give us,
Yes.
bring the food down, let's give us about 15 minutes to fill our plates up.
It's fine. It's fine to do that.
We will continue.
Now, the next part that we'll talk about is the collection at Stanford University, because this is something that every state needs to do. And contribute to their state university as a historical collection, because Stanford was so happy to get it. I couldn't believe it. And it evolved because Sue Kavari, maybe you know the Kavari family, they live in Palo Alto where Stanford is. Their son is the head of the dermatology department there, and they found out who is the curator of the library. That's the person we should contact. And my daughter and Sue Kavari went there, they contacted them, and he came to my house to check out what my 60-year collection was. So he saw the books. We took him in the closet where the file cabinets are, in the garage where the file cabinets are. And he said, "I'll take whatever you send me." So over 1,000 items are already there. Mostly books, mostly really old books, because people who died would give me their books. I've got books, early Baha'i books, and a lot of 50s, 60s, 70s books, videotapes, cassette tapes, they're all gone there. And what is the hardest part is the filing of the files. Those 500 onion skin papers, that somebody put on the internet, scanned it on the internet. So they are on it. I just don't know I wouldn't know how to get them off of it. But anyway, someday future generations will get them. So we'll do that, and we'll talk about it later.
Thank you. Food is almost here.
And you're kind. It's just great to be with you. Yeah.
I'd like to ask, while we're getting refreshments ready, if you have any questions for Arden. One of the
Appointed different people to show us around to the holy places. In Isfahan, it was Nader. And they appointed these young, wonderful Baha'is because my daughters were teenagers. And so Nader was, they called him the philosopher, because he was the teacher of the youth in Isfahan in those days. And so he took us to the grave of the king of martyrs and beloved of martyrs, and Keith Ransom Kaler, which was there in Isfahan. And it was when we were sitting in the airport, we were going back to Tehran, that the plane wouldn't take off because there weren't enough people in it. So it was like 3 hours sitting there, 3 hours, and then 4 hours. Finally, he said, "Wouldn't you like some ice cream?" So we went in there. And this was frozen ice water, ice sugar water. And we thought, I'm seeing him sitting there, eat that, and I'm thinking about the place near my house in Milwaukee where we have frozen custard. This is so fantastic. Yeah. Yes, you may even know it. Yes. It's not there anymore, unfortunately, but in those days it was. And I knew that I was supposed to help him get out of Iran. I had no idea how bad the persecution would become, and he didn't believe it would be bad. He just really wanted to stay in Iran. He loved being there. He didn't want to come. But it was imperative that he get out. And so another event, we met the National Spiritual Assembly, and Mr. Gaya Mogami was the secretary at that time, and he had a daughter who was 16 years old, like my daughters. And after we got home, he phoned us, and he said, "My daughter's not able to go to school anymore. Baha'is can't go to school anymore." It had to be January. Things were so bad for the Baha'is. Khomeini had not yet quite arrived, but when he did arrive, it was the 30th, and Sarah Gaya Mogami arrived on a flight, one of the last ones out of Tehran, to the U.S. on the day before Khomeini came in. So she arrived in Chicago, at the Chicago airport, and we were in Milwaukee, 90 miles away, and it was a blizzard. It was the worst weather you can imagine. Blowing winds, snow. So we're on the freeway to go to the airport in Chicago to get her, and we're following a snowplow, and we're late getting there. By the time we get there, it's nighttime, and there's nobody in the airport. Everything is closed. And there, sitting alone, is this 16-year-old girl, crying, because there's nobody anywhere. And she doesn't know if we're ever going to come and get her or not. It was so hard for this girl. Anyway, when we got to her and we took her to our home, she went to the school in English, an English school when she's from Iran, and graduated just as with as good grades as anybody, and with my girls. And it was, she had arrived first before Nader came. And we all went to that frozen custard place. It was a big celebration. We all had frozen custard, and Nader had one called the Ballpark Special. And it had 4 big scoops of frozen custard with pecans, strawberries, chocolate, whipped cream. Oh, that we got pictures of that one. We make Ballpark Specials every time he comes through Reno. Yeah. My husband said to him, there's a tradition here that if you eat one of these, the place will give you the second one free. He ate 2.
When you were visiting
I did.
Shiraz. Okay.
I met him in Shiraz,
You met him in
and he was in the House of the Bab.
Okay.
Yes. And he was very happy to see my teenage daughters, and he said, I hope you will come back again. And of course, that's a dream to go there. Just, it fulfilled a dream to be in the House of the Bab. And of course we thought, and we have a picture of ourselves because we had covered. We were covered to go there before the sun came up in the morning, like around dawn, so that we wouldn't be noticed, And we went there with a person who took us, and we met him. Of course, they always know Americans because of our shoes. So the shoes are showing out. We got all this stuff down to them, but anyone would know who we were. There was no doubt about that. But we were there, and we have in the picture the tree that was planted by the Bab, and the oranges were hanging still on the tree. That's on this picture. It's a small patio, and then there's a little well, which was the pure water until the enemies poisoned it way back, many, many years before that. So the well water could never be used again. Nevertheless, the tree was there that he had planted. And we never, ever imagined that that house would be destroyed. That was one of the crushing blows of the persecution, that they actually destroyed that house. Very, very sad for all the Baha'is. I should remember the name of the person who took us there, but I don't. On the first visit that I made there in the 60s, there was a woman named Fatimeh. She was the caretaker of the House of the Bab. And she had been there when Martha Root had been there. And that had to be in the 30s and the 20s, way back when Martha Root went there. And she told us the story of there's a stairway, the marble stairway, that went up to the second floor where the Bab was with Mullah Hussein and where the declaration took place. And when Martha Root, she said, went up those stairs, she stopped about the 3rd or 4th stair, and put her head down. And none of us knew what was going to happen because she stayed there a really long time. And then eventually she lifted her head. There was a pool of water on the stairs. And she said, "What a great cause to come from such a little house." Really is an amazing thought. She was so overwhelmed by the power, and she was so sensitive to it. And we are very blessed to have been there. Of course, it will be reconstructed, but the original one is gone, and that is very sad. Yeah. Yes, dear.
I have one question. You spoke about being with the Guardian, and I'm wondering if Audrey and John Robards were there at that time?
No, they weren't. Millie Collins was there, and Mason Remy was there, and Leroy Iowis and his wife. You know, Leroy Iowis is another story of great sacrifice. His family, his mother and father became Baha'is in Chicago, among the first in the whole country. And he grew up as a Baha'i. He became a vice president of the Southern Pacific Railroad, and he had about 6 months to go for retirement. But when the Guardian called him and said, "I need help," because all the Guardian's family had turned away from him, Leroy left right then. He didn't wait his 6 months to get retired. He left right then, and his wife Sylvia sold the house, got rid of everything, and joined him in the Holy Land. But they didn't wait for him to retire. I'm sure he got a certain retirement, but however, it was a very difficult thing. The people at the railroad had promoted him over the years. You know, he was so honest, so knowledgeable, and they didn't want him to go. But those are the sacrifices: instant, exact, and complete obedience to the Guardian. What I would talk about now would be about the collection. And it's these dear people, the Kavaris, who had a connection with Stanford, and my daughter, who didn't want to deal with all the thousands of stuff I had in my house. She said, what would be the best thing to do? Well, if it can serve a purpose as a source for information and history of the Baha'i faith to Stanford University, that would be the best thing. And that's how they worked it out. So when the curator came and said he'd take anything, we started with great big boxes, plastic. They were plastic, which my daughter and her husband Chip brought from California, and I filled them up, and they had a big van sort of thing, and they took them to Stanford. And that was easy, but I don't have a computer. So I wrote down I've got a book, every title, author, publisher, date, listing every one of the 1,000 things that it went. And then I worked on the files. Well, the files are wonderful because back in 1966, Jack and I went to Greenacre, and a Baha'i had returned from being a pioneer to South Africa. Her name was Elizabeth Ober. So Elizabeth is the second wife of Harlan Ober, and Grace Ober, his first wife, is the one who collected this huge collection that was stored in an attic of the Ober home. It was a cottage at Greenacre. And Elizabeth came back. Harlan had died in Africa. She had to sell that house, that cottage, and she had to get rid of everything in the attic. And I just took as much as I could. I'm sure some treasures were lost because she didn't know what to do with all that. And so it's from 1966 until now that this has been stored in my house in files, and that's what I'm still going through. But what's significant is every Baha'i community has a history. No matter how many people were there, even if it's a few people, it should be written down, it should be recorded, it should be, every old thing should be saved. And this should be a part of your state's history, because the Baha'i faith is the moving force of history that's happening now. Wherever Baha'i lives, wherever they have lived, all of it is history. Not only of the state, but in future, that's what historians are going to look at. What did the Baha'is do? Who were they? You know, if we can compare the times, which are almost incomparable, however, when Christ came, and those fishermen accepted him 2,000 years ago, those fishermen never thought that 2,000 years after them, we'd be naming our children after them. They never thought that. So we must think that. We must know that every Baha'i today is part of the history of wherever we are and of the world changing on the path of Baha'u'lláh. So you collect your history, you find somebody at the University of Minnesota who knows that we are a part of the state's history, some way. And I was told by the curator, that's what this picture is. On October 6th of 2012 was 100 years since Abdu'l-Baha spoke at Stanford. And that's when we dedicated the collection. And the Stanford University had a reception for the Baha'is in the rotunda of this huge library. And the curator was there, he's here, John Iltz. And this is Hooper Dunbar, who is retired from the Universal House of Justice. And he came and he spoke. I spoke about some of the experiences, but however, the important thing was, on this 100th anniversary, other Baha'is who lived near there came forth with their own collections and added it to this one I told you about. Charlene Magzi, her husband, a Persian man, had recently died. He had a huge collection of Persian books in Farsi and in Arabic, and she at that time contributed it to him, to the collection. And this was becoming a really big thing, you know. Then we talked, my daughter and I talked with John Iltz, and we said, you know, there are many Baha'is who can contribute to this collection, but also, how do we make this collection an endowment? What does it mean? He said an endowment means that the university will continue the collection by buying new things that come out regarding the faith, books and things, that they will add it to the collection in time, as time passes. But that the Baha'is had to raise $5,000 within 5 years to contribute to this. So that was raised that day. It didn't take 5 years. It happened then. It happened right then. And the reason is there is no such collection in the whole country, maybe in the whole world, but that this one was so important to the university. He said, John Iltz remembered Firuz Kazemzadeh as a student, remembered Amin Banani, who was a student. So he remembered the Baha'i students. And he felt this is really significant. And he sent an email, a message to the New York Times, and it came out in the New York Times. And it's really quite remarkable. The Baha'i collection has been established at Stanford. Now, another thing he taught us, he said, when you go to a university, and especially, and here, he said, because they had their own huge chapel and everything. He said, don't go to the religious department, go to the humanities department, because the churches are in control of the religious department, and they will think that you are just proselytizing their people. Go to the humanities department. And that's what we are anyway. We're interested in making the world a better place. That's why we're doing what we do and why Baha'u'lláh came. So that was a good message. So when you go, you check out the humanities department of your university, get to know the people who are in the libraries, or the curators and archives, because we're history in every state where we are. So no, and is there anything that you want to, yes?
Regarding the collection at Stanford, so can we now tell our friends that live there that yes, you can go to the Stanford Library and ask to see the Baha'i collection, or?
Not yet.
Okay.
I'll tell you why. I mean, that stuff has been there for 3 years, those 1,000 books, yes. But the reason they are not processing it through their computers until I get all the others there. When they start doing this, they want everything at once. And I haven't finished the files yet. I've got 36 boxes in my house all around, and with different labels like Baha'i House of Worship, the Baha'i Faith in Wisconsin, Baha'i Faith in California and Arizona. Some say Baha'i Heroes. Some say Immortals, Baha'i Immortals. I mean, Knights of Baha'u'lláh, and stories of Asia, the Fosdar family. The Fosdar family has their own box, I mean, with lots of files in it. Their history. So when I tried to get some information from Jamshen Fosdar, who's 86 years old, living in Singapore, he said, all you have to do is go online. I'm not going to write any more pages. We got 12 volumes online about what the Fosdar family did in Asia. And that is incredible. I don't know how to tell you how to enter that, but I mean, that's all about the Baha'i faith. So something goes into the file on Fosdars for Stanford to access the 12 volumes that are available on the Baha'i faith in Asia. Yeah.
So once it's all done, then there will be a special event where it's.
There may be another event.
Community?
Most surely, by October of this year, there'll be another event at the library, which will be the 101 anniversary of Abdu'l-Baha coming there. But whether I will be finished with the files by then, I don't know. Nevertheless, there are still some books in there. I mean, that were not mine. Yeah. And this is what they have done. What they have created is an explanation of this, and they put it in together with an envelope, and it says, my son-in-law mailed these to a lot of Baha'is there, commemorating the 100th anniversary, so it's dated, of course, 2012. And it tells about the collection. And then tells about Dr. Paul Kavari, who started this with the curator, and it's the fund for the Jack and Arden Lee Baha'i collection at Stanford University Libraries. Well, that's the first time. It doesn't necessarily mean that when you start one in Minnesota, you have to make it an endowment. You can make it, because I don't know what their requirements would be. If the requirements are less, it's easier to get them to make it in perpetuity, to keep going and going and buying new things. If that happens, you know, if it's just the collection, that's acceptable too. It doesn't have to be an endowment. This one just evolved that way, easily. I mean, what, honey?
I was raised Mormon and became a Baha'i about 3 years ago. So do you know, in all of your years of being a Baha'i, do you know anything about the history of the interaction between Mormonism and the faith?
I do have the Book of Mormon, but I have, and the Mormon men elders, they come to the door quite often. And I always invite them in. And we always talk about the Baha'i faith. But my knowledge, I have known some people come from the Mormon faith in the Reno area as well. But I'm not knowledgeable enough to know how that fits together. Illinois is important because that's where Joseph Smith died. And the Brigham Young faction left from there and went to Salt Lake City. But I don't know the book well enough to explain that. In any case, we know it is a Christian faith. You know, it's one of the branches of Christianity. It's not a sort of, it's another denomination of Christianity, because that's what Joseph Smith wanted to do, was to interpret it. But he had his own visions. And his visions when he was a prisoner in Illinois had to do with being alive. There was something about the vision saying to him that he would be alive while the spirit was still in the world. So he lived around the time that Baha'u'lláh died. He was still alive in Illinois then. Do you know anything about that?
He also prophesied the coming of Baha'u'lláh. And so a lot of Mormons at the time, in 1844, realized that this was the time, according to the prophecies. And so they all gave away their stuff, as well as a lot of other Christian cults, and waited for Jesus to come down on a cloud. And I was in a dentist's office one time and found out he was a Mormon, and he had a Mormon magazine. I was waiting, and I read the article about this great time when they were all waiting for the return. And ever since, they called it the Great Disillusionment.
Oh, yeah.
It didn't happen the way they thought, so they thought they made a mistake.
They thought they made a mistake. And I think other Christian groups had the same response, because they had figured out the time. In the book of Daniel, the time is mentioned, how you figure it out. One day is as a year, that's mentioned in there, and there are explanations of what, that always comes out to 1844, which is the beginning of the new age of fulfillment with the coming of the Bab. That came out of the book of Daniel. So there are many indications, but very often people as individual seekers can find the answers. But if you ask your minister and your religious leaders, they will not accept it. That's just how it has been over the ages. That's why we have to be individual seekers after truth, where Baha'u'lláh says we seek truth as part of our religion.
I was wondering, having spent all of that time during your pilgrimage to Shogi Effendi, if you could just talk a little bit about what he was like more as a person rather than as the guardian, because we have all these, images of him as the guardian of the faith and the priceless pearl and all of that, but, the quality of his voice, his nature, is just the personal aspects of what he was like.
Yes. Of course, his presence was unique for us. There were 9 pilgrim days, and one of the days he didn't come for dinner. He was ill, and when he didn't come to dinner, we were all of us seated there we just didn't want to eat. We didn't want to eat because we felt something so important was missing from our table. We just could hardly not. It was a presence that we missed very much. And after every dinner, Ruhia Khanum would take us up to a little sitting room, and she would talk with the pilgrims about what he said and what it meant. And that night, we just went up to that little room and said prayers for him. And there's a prayer specifically that she said for him. It's one of them in the prayer book, but I don't have that handy right now. If I should let you know, I'll let Janine know when I find it, and I'll let you know. And we would be so concerned about him being ill. If I were to go on with this, it's this. He was not happy those days of my pilgrimage. He was sad, and he was sad about America. And it was May 1954. In July 1954 came out his longest message to America, which is American Baha'is in Time of World Peril. It's published in a Wellspring of Guidance, and it came out 2 months after that. And it was something, if you can study it now, you can get it on the internet, but it makes a person think about really what's going on in this country. So that came out in 1954 and was an explanation after I got back from pilgrimage of why he was so sad while he was writing that letter. His hands were unique to me. His hands were always in motion, and he was always thinking of the faith as he's speaking to each one of the persons. He might ask Leroy, I was to say, what happened when you were in Jerusalem today? Or he might ask somebody else, questions about where they were. If he was a pilgrim, he would ask the pilgrims how the Baha'i community was where they live, things like that. His hands had square fingers. I had never seen hands like his. And I still think of his motion and the motion of his hands. And he was so thinking of the faith every moment of his life that on one of those occasions, Millie Collins, Ruhia Khanum, and Sylvia, I was the one, they took turns making dessert. And one occasion, Millie Collins she used to order ice cream mixes from America in boxes and make ice cream for him. But in this occasion, she didn't have time to do that, and she served apples. So everyone had an apple, and he ate it. And when we went up afterwards to talk about it, Ruhia Khanum said, he doesn't like apples, and he wouldn't have eaten it if he'd known what he was doing there. He was eating whatever was put in front of him, and he didn't realize it was an apple because his mind was thinking about the faith regarding all these people sitting at this table, 13 people usually, and he just ate what was there. She said he doesn't like apples.
Arden, did he always wear a fez? I mean, all the photos we have him, except when he was a young man,
Yes,
he was wearing a
yes,
fez.
yes. He did wear a fez. And when my last day of pilgrimage, and he shook my hand and said goodbye, he said, I will pray for your family. Woo, I hadn't thought about them the whole 9 days I was there. So, you learn in many different ways by going there. I hadn't thought about that. But what happened was, 7 years later, my brother and his family lived in Arizona. They became Baha'is. 7 years. And then, at about the same time, my mother lived in Wisconsin, became a Baha'i in the 60s. So I knew it was from his prayers because they had not an interest in being Baha'is before that.
Arden, excuse me, could you tell us before you met the guardian, and then after you met the guardian, did you notice any difference within yourself?
Well, I tell you, there was an effect, certainly. I felt more able to receive guidance and think of things in a different way, because I was supposed to marry somebody when I got back from this trip, which lasted 9 months. I went to India, to the Indian conference, to Hong Kong for a period of time and worked there for 3 months. And then I got the message I could go on pilgrimage from there through the American Express office. It came, and then I took a ship and went all the way back from where I'd come and got my visa in Cyprus to get to Israel, and did some of it by ship, most of that traveling by ship. And then I was to go back and marry this man in Wisconsin. And I knew after I left pilgrimage that that wasn't going to happen. I had a different feeling about wanting to serve the faith first. That's when I decided I wanted to go to Asia and went to Cambodia in 1956 to 58. And in those days, you couldn't get into Cambodia unless you had a job with a government to get a visa. You could stay as a tourist for a week, you couldn't stay longer. And so I got the job with the U.S. government in the foreign aid program and went to Cambodia for 2 years. And I'm so grateful I went there. I really established a connection with those people. I love that country and those people. And going back in 2012, it's a totally different place, of course. Nothing like it was back then. But the Baha'i communities in Cambodia now, that's where the House of Justice is going to build a house of worship in Battambang. Battambang is the rice-growing area of Cambodia, not the big city. There are two big cities. Phnom Penh is the capital, and Siem Reap is the entrance to Angkor Wat, which is the famous place of the old civilization. No, it's going to be in Battambang, and that's the place where the farmers live. And it's very exciting. And in fact, more than that, a Baha'i named Dr. Lulu, I forget how to say these names, Ludhir. Anyway, she is a Malaysian lady who is a doctor of education who has started, she's also a counselor, she started a Baha'i university. I think 50 people go there. It's a house that's been made into a university, and the government of Cambodia recognizes it and sent them a plaque that they were highly rated and so on. And my granddaughter and her brother went there for 2 months to prepare for the youth conference, which was also in Battambang when all the youth conferences took place. And they spoke there at the university. There's a Baha'i children's school, and pioneers who came from India and Pakistan and what's that other country down there? Bangladesh, that's the one. A number of pioneers from Bangladesh went there. And from Malaysia, they opened up a restaurant, one of them from Malaysia. They're enterprising. One of them is a doctor of mathematics teaching at another university there. I mean, these things have evolved with Baha'is also making sacrifices to leave there. One of the persons living there is a lawyer for the United Nations. He is the son of Violette and Ali Nakjavani. And he and his wife have twin children, and they are in that country because the United Nations is trying to find the people who caused the killing fields that you know about. Whereas the Cambodians themselves, they don't want to know anything more about it. They don't want to talk about it, think about it. They don't want the United Nations there. They want to forget it. Nevertheless, the country has made a museum of if you can imagine, the skulls of all these dead people. And when you go to Cambodia now, you don't see the old people. They all died during the killing fields when they were 40. And now there are hardly any old people in the whole country. And they're all young people. It's a place that has suffered, really suffered. And maybe because of that, they're open to spiritual realities. It's a beautiful country in many ways, but it's really a difficult place for those who still live there.
Arden, it's after 9 o'clock,
Okay,
and so I know, was there a quote that you wanted to read?
I do have one.
And then if anyone wants to stay and talk to Arden, you're certainly welcome to do that. And we're going to try to be leaving the Baha'i Center around 9:30.
I really thank you for being here. It's so wonderful to meet these ladies and everybody. It's been Ron says it's 4 years since I was here before. And this is a great joy because even though I came for a wedding last weekend, the truth is the most meaningful gatherings are with the friends, with the Baha'is. That is the most, whenever you travel anywhere, wherever you go, you want to find the Baha'is there. That's the most important part of the trip. And in my files of many things, I found this, and I want to memorize it. It's from Baha'u'lláh. Walk above the world by the power of the greatest name, that thou mayest see the secrets of pre-existence and know that which none know of. We have so much opportunity to discover what nobody knows. It's all new.
Could you read that one more time?
Walk above the world by the power of the greatest name, that thou mayest see the secrets of pre-existence and know that which none know of. Thank you, dear friends. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank
Arden, I need one decent picture of you
you. Oh,
smiling.
I don't know if that's
Just a sec.
possible.
Don't you worry about that smile, baby. Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. I'm going to leave this with you,
Oh, thank
just
you.
as information, something that might help in